Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Today we're diving deep into some fascinating, and perhaps a little concerning, developments in European politics, particularly within Germany. We're going to explore how certain narratives are taking hold and what that might mean for the future. Now, imagine this. Representatives of a major German political party publish a manifesto. It calls for a complete U-turn in Germany's foreign policy. They're against increasing defense spending. They don't want American weapons on German soil. Instead, they're pushing for cooperation and dialogue with Russia. So, you might be thinking, oh, this sounds like the extreme right-wing pro-Russian crowd. It must be the AfD, right? Well, not so fast. This manifesto actually came from the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, which is part of Germany's governing coalition. And this, my friends, is a perfect moment to really dig into several key aspects of both German and broader European policy. Stick with me, because it's going to be an insightful discussion. First, let's unpack the manifesto itself. Now, I don't speak German, so I relied on a translator, but the essence is clear. The SPD politicians write, in Germany and in most European countries, the advantages were gained by the forces that strive for the future, based primarily on the strategy of military confrontation and hundreds of billions of euros for armaments. They also claim that peace and security can no longer be achieved with Russia, but can only be executed against Russia. But here's where it gets really interesting. The manifesto counters this by stating, we are convinced that the concept of common security is the only responsible way to prevent war. The authors here are pointing to arms control treaties as the ultimate way to manage security, something they say worked in the past. And while Russia's invasion of Ukraine is called illegal, the document strangely suggests that the West, particularly the Americans, are more often responsible for breaking existing arms control agreements. So, let's be blunt. This document has a very pro-Russian feel to it. It's almost a soft, digestible paraphrase of the Russian narrative about the war's causes, tailored for a Western, or at least German, audience. This is especially true when it comes to the Russian interpretation of the indivisibility of security principle. In a nutshell, it frames Russian aggression as a necessary defense in response to Western violations of international law. It reminds me of the Kremlin spokesman who, just 4 days before the war, declared that Russia had never attacked anyone. Beyond being pro-Russian, this document is also strongly anti-American. The manifesto states that under the rule of President Trump, the USA is once again conducting a policy of confrontation, especially against China. This increases the danger of further militarization of international relations. It then proposes that Europe must counter this with independent, peace-oriented security policy and must actively contribute to the return to the order of cooperative security. So, what exactly are these German Social Democrats proposing? Well, among their key demands we find an immediate end to the war in Ukraine through dialogue with Russia, halting the arms race, achieving independence from the United States, opposing the deployment of American missiles in Germany, a gradual return to eased relations and cooperation with Russia, and finally, new agreements on arms control. Now, it's easy to jump to conclusions here and say Germany is just waiting for an opportunity to renegotiate with the Russians. But we need to be fair and emphasize that this document has been heavily criticized, not just by other German political parties, but even by other members of the SPD itself. For example, Germany's Minister of Defense, who is also from the SPD, called the manifesto a disapproving denial of reality, and stressed that negotiations with Russia can only happen from a position of strength. Coalition partners like the CDU-CSU have also criticized it. Former Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently stated that Nord Stream 2 was a mistake, and his visit to the United States was marked by a clearly anti-Russian stance. So, it's clear that German politics has diverse viewpoints. This specific tandem of Chancellor Scholz and Defense Minister Pistorius, for instance, represents a decidedly skeptical view of the Russian Federation. You might be tempted to theorize that the Germans are playing a few pianos, showing one face publicly while sending other signals through channels like this manifesto. However, this manifesto, emerging from the heart of German politics, is yet more evidence of something I've been talking about for months, really since the war began. This theme constantly reappears in the background, especially when Germany is the topic. As soon as conditions allow for a renewal of political or economic cooperation with Moscow, there will be forces in Europe intensely pursuing it. And these forces are particularly visible in Germany. It's like a dripping rock. Scarcely a week goes by without some political signal from Germany, whether in economics, raw materials, energy, or security, that rationalizes a return to deep political relations with the Russian Federation. It's worth noting how effectively the Russians are reaching key power players with their narrative, with their outlook on the war. We see it in the United States, and we certainly see it in Germany. Decades of very close political and economic relations must have left a deep trace of institutional and personal contacts that are clearly at play here. Because, once again, this is a one-to-one echo of the Russian narrative concerning security and the war's causes, just presented euphemistically, in a mild sauce designed to be palatable for a European audience. And remember, we're talking about German Social Democracy, a center-left party that co-creates the current ruling coalition. So this isn't some fringe group, it's a faction within the very heart of the German government. This brings me to a common argument in foreign policy debates, attributing pro-Russian attitudes and views exclusively to right-wing circles. This is a prevalent yet often shallow argument used to score political points in superficial debates. You hear things like, all right-wing European parties are pro-Putin parties, or this international European right-wing party has extremely pro-Russian factions. Such arguments are frequent in Polish public debate, for instance, but they are incredibly shallow and unwise. If, for example, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, were to read this manifesto, penned by German left-wing politicians, she would likely shred it to pieces. It's simply not that straightforward. Now, I'm not trying to single out right-wing circles here, because it is also a problem on the European right. There are indeed segments of the European right that hold very positive views of the Russian Federation. And this perspective is often based on the absurd assumption that Russia and Vladimir Putin are some kind of conservative champions of values. This, by the way, is a crucial propaganda line for the Russian Federation, very strong in social media. Alexander Dugin often speaks about it, framing the conflict between Russia and the West as a fight between good and evil, a battle of traditional conservative values against some form of depravity. Often, these elements are linked to sexual orientation or simply faith. At its most extreme, this religious narrative portrays Russia on a crusade fighting the Antichrist. While the idea of Russia as a reservoir of traditional conservative Christian values is, frankly, nonsensical, especially when combined with the fight against globalists, which resonates strongly online, particularly with elements of the European right, it does work on some people. Especially those who view Russia from a distance through rose-tinted glasses. Yes, there are people on the European right who genuinely believe Russia is a champion of conservatism, fighting globalists, depravity, and everything associated with the left-liberal worldview. It's also interesting how pro-Russian politicians are often automatically categorized as extreme right, even when it makes no sense. A great example is Robert Fico, the current Prime Minister of Slovakia. I've often heard him labeled an extreme right-wing politician. While his party's ideology and the political situation in Slovakia are indeed complex topics, Fico himself comes from social democracy. He's currently suspended from his party, but he's historically a radical leftist. Then there's the peculiar logic often applied to Fidesz and Viktor Orbán in Polish public life. Fidesz is an ally of PiS and an ally of Putin, therefore PiS is an ally of Putin. Setting aside the sheer genius of that reasoning, and acknowledging that there was a period of very clear rapprochement between PiS and Fidesz, these parties were never in the same faction in the European Parliament. For most of the time until 2021, Fidesz was in the EPP, the European People's Party, the same faction as Poland's Civic Platform and PSL. They didn't move to the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists, also, or perhaps primarily, because of their differing approaches to Russia. It's just not that simple. Trying to assign pro-Russian attitudes and views to only one group, one ideological faction within European politics, is a complete misunderstanding of a very serious problem. It's merely a rhetorical trick, a shallow argument in a very superficial public debate. Because the truth is, pro-Russian attitudes and views can be found in many different places across the European political spectrum. Yes, they can be found on the European right, but they can also be found in the very heart of the establishment, like in German social democracy, which is producing manifestos like the one we discussed today. And honestly, Germany provides the ultimate argument here. Because it's hard to find a more pro-Russian and influential party in European politics than Angela Merkel's CDU-CSU historically was. How strong the forces striving for a swift repair of political and economic relations with the Russian Federation will be depends largely on the condition of the German economy, which is still in very poor shape. For this year, economic stagnation on the verge of recession is still predicted. But in the coming quarters, an economic stimulus package is expected to be announced, based on lowering the debt limit, which we discussed a few months ago. So, the economy is expected to rebound. But regardless of the scale of that rebound, it's certain that there will be a group of people within German public, business, and political life who, as soon as the opportunity arises, will push for a reset of relations with the Russian Federation, economically, politically, and in terms of security. The question is, first, whether this faction will gain dominance within Germany itself, and second, whether it will be possible to counter such a decision, either at the EU level or through bilateral or multilateral agreements. This is something that needs to be considered right now. These signals need to be understood, and strategies need to be formulated in case such a scenario unfolds. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I'll see you next time.